Numbers chapter 14. Over the last few weeks, I've been just reading through Numbers and taking notes and asking the Lord to teach. And I want to share a few things out of Numbers today. As you turn there to Numbers 14, we know that God has been good. We just sang about that. He has richly blessed us. God had richly blessed the nation of Israel. They had been in bondage in Egypt, and He had delivered them out by a mighty hand, a strong hand. He had delivered them out of Egypt, and He was bringing them into the promised land. And as they began to go over there, we see that where we get to in chapter 14, Moses had sent the spies over into the promised land, and they had come back. They had been instructed on what to do when they got there, and they came back and they gave a report. And we know that report. There were 2 that gave a good report, Caleb and Joshua, and there were 10 that gave a bad report. And so we're going to dive into that in just a minute. When we think about these verses and the life of Moses and what God had called him to, we know that God had called Moses to be a spiritual leader over the nation of Israel. As we think about his leadership and some lessons that we'll learn today, there's a word that comes to mind that we see when we realize we're called to a position of leadership. Each one of us have certain things that we are to lead and to watch over. But here's a word that's often used as an opposite of leadership, and it's the word passive. Anyone ever heard of the word passive? So when we talk about the word passive, that word in the financial world is one that it's used in particular because retirees want to get to a point where they have passive income. Passive income comes by way of rental property. And who in here likes passive income? If you have any, you like passive income, whether it's Social Security, it's a pension, it's investments, it's interest income, it's rental income. You want to get to a point where you've got some passive income. To be passive in that regard means that I receive the benefits of this with minimal effort. Now, if you've got a rental house, you're going to have to do a few things here and there, but by and large, it's just coming in every single week. It's passive income. Doesn't take much activity. But as we think about this word in regards to leadership, and in particular its derivative of passivity, the word passivity means this. It's a quality or state of being inactive, submissive, or not taking initiative or action, especially when action might be expected or beneficial. It's the opposite of being assertive, proactive, decisive, or taking initiative. I remember when I went to China 20-something years ago, and I attended one of the state-sanctioned churches. Over there you had churches that met underground, that were operating outside the boundaries of the Chinese government, but then you had state-sanctioned churches. And I remember in particular going to that church, and it was the females that were leading pretty much the entire service. And you know where the men were? They were sitting in the very back rows. That's what it looks like to be passive in that regards. And so passivity is something that trend of passivity, we want to honor the women in the church here at Bethlehem. And in many ways, the women of our churches have carried heavier loads than men throughout the years. But that trend needs to change. We need men that will carry the load and be willing to lead their wives and their children well, to lead, have the willingness to take on a little heavier load, to be able to lead in other places as well in the church. One person said that a sign of a healthy church was crying babies and singing men. And so I'm grateful for you singing men in here this morning that are here with your families leading the way. Robert Lewis said this about manhood. He said this: A real man rejects passivity, accepts responsibility, chooses to lead courageously, and expects the greater rewards. I think that's a great definition. A real man will reject passivity, accept responsibility, choose to lead courageously, and expect the greater rewards. We can go ahead and say, just as Moses would share with us, that the road to the promised land or the road to glory is not going to be an easy road, but we know that it will be a blessed road. And God had chosen out Moses here in this book that he might be used by God to move God's people on to God's agenda. And so with that said, let's look at a few of these lessons in the life of Moses today. I'll begin reading in verse 1 of Numbers chapter 14, and we'll make reference to some of the earlier chapters. It says, "And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And the whole congregation said unto them, Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God that we had died in this wilderness? And wherefore hath the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return unto Egypt? And they said one to another, Let us make a captain, and let us return unto Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, which were of them that searched the land, rent their clothes. And they spake unto the company of the children of Israel, saying, The land which we passed through to search it is an exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, and He will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only rebel not against ye the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. But all the congregation bade stone them with stones. And the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of the congregation before all the children of Israel. And the Lord said unto Moses, How long will this people provoke me? And how long will it be ere they believe me for all the signs which I have showed among them? I will smite them with a pestilence and disinherit them, and will make of thee a greater nation and mightier than they. And Moses said unto the Lord, Then the Egyptians shall hear, for thou broughtest up this people in thy might among them, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of the land, for they have heard that thou art among the people, and thou art, Lord, art seen face to face, and that thy cloud standeth over them, that thou goest before them by daytime in a pillar of a cloud, and in a pillar of fire by night. As he goes on down through here, it says that Moses begins to intercede on behalf of the people. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But the title of the message this morning is going to be Spiritual Leadership. Spiritual leadership. Learn some lessons from the life of Moses. As we see here, how many of you have decided, sometimes decided, that I'm going to step in and I'm going to take on some greater responsibility and I'm going to lead well to the best of my ability? How many of you have done that, and in the process of doing that, you have faced discouragement? And so we see that here in the life of Moses. Spiritual leadership will face discouragement. We'll see also in this lesson this morning, spiritual leadership requires much courage. If we're going to do the will of God in our individual lives, and we're going to lead our families in that way, do you realize that we have the world and the flesh and the devil that are already in opposition to us moving up to higher ground and following after wholeheartedly what God would have us to do? And so it's going to take courage to be willing to step out in faith and do what God calls us to do. And finally, spiritual leadership delights in glorifying God among His people and in the world. And that's very important. that the glory of God, as we consider spiritual leadership, we could talk about corporate leadership and talk about business principles, because when people are in business, their goals, many times the goal is to make a name for themselves, to make a name for their company, to be able to produce the highest amount of profits possible so that we can look back and say that this corporation, this business is a very successful business. And many times, whether the numbers rise or fall determines how much success there is in that business. But this morning I want you to know that our motivation should not be that. It must be the glory of God. There's going to be discouraging moments. There are going to be challenging moments. But if we will be reminded that we are to move on to God's agenda because we're here to display His glory in our lives, those times of deep valleys, when we look up and say, God, I may be in a deep valley, a dark hole, a difficult situation right now, but Your glory is worth it. I'm going to press through. I'm not going to quit, and I'm not going to give up, because the Bible tells us that we are not to be weary in well-doing, for in due season you shall reap if you faint not. But we find here in the life of Moses, he got to a critical stage in his life. And we'll look back into chapter 11 and follow along with that. So let's look at this first point here on lessons from the life of Moses. Spiritual leadership will face discouragement. God had blessed them. He had given them so much already. As we look back and see what God had done to the nation of Israel, by God's grace and power, God had chosen Moses. He had selected him from the backside of the desert. Moses has spent his first 40 years in Egypt. He has spent 40 years on the backside of the desert tending sheep. And God all of a sudden appeared there in the burning bush. And He called him out. Moses recognized that that burning bush was burning. It was a consuming fire. And it was not burning up. And God began to speak to him. And He called him out. He said, Moses. Moses, and God revealed Himself to him. And so God had began to work in Moses' life. And as we see that God had not only done that, but He had, as we see in the book of Numbers, God had numbered them. There were 603,550 men that were 20 years old and upward, that God had selected Moses to lead these men and the rest of the people of Israel into the promised land. He had given them instructions on organizing their camp. He had given them leaders to oversee the things. He had given them the high priesthood. He had given them the instruction to carry on the Passover every single year as a reminder of their redemption. God had been so good to them. He had provided them with manna to eat, because who could feed 603,550 20-year-old men and upward? Who could provide that amount of nourishment to sustain them in the wilderness? And God had been so good to them that every day He rained manna down from on high. All they had to do is go out there and pick it up. But we get to this critical stage here. Turn back with me to Numbers chapter 11 for a moment. Moses is going to face some discouragements along the way. It's much like if you're a parent in here. How many times have you said, we're going to go eat over here, and you've got some children that rise up and say, I don't want that. I don't want to do that, or I don't want to work. I don't want to serve in that capacity. If you're a parent in here, you know what it's like to try to lead and then face automatic discouragement. But we all know that the attitude can be shifted, and by the end of the day, as you lead your children well, by the end of the day, you've got a plan in place. This is what we're going to do. Many times by the end of the day, they realize, I am so glad that I listened to what you had to say. And isn't it amazing that when we follow and obey God's Word and seek after Him, that He always has a way to lead us, even though we may have some opposition at the beginning. God has the ability to change our attitude, and we get to the end of the day or the end of that season, and we say, God, Your way is best. But we see Moses is dealing with some discouragement. Let's look at here in Numbers chapter 11, beginning in verse 1. And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and His anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. Now, Moses had faced several times of discouragement. One of them was when he went up to the mountain and received the law of God. And Aaron had been there and he said, "Bring me your gold." And they began to throw it into the fire. And they began to form and fashion a golden calf. And they began to rise up and dance and be merry. They began to worship idols. They began to say, "This golden calf is what just displayed power to get us out of Egypt." People can be very fickle, can't they? And they can turn on a dime. But that was discouraging. But we see here again, Moses is facing discouragement from the people. They are beginning to complain. To complain means to express discontent or displeasure or unhappiness. Do you realize that you can't please all the people all of the time? And Moses, that was one of the things, and the Lord said they were complaining. Look at this. In verse 1, it says they were complaining against their misfortunes, the difficulties that they were going through. But notice some things just hadn't changed. They were complaining when they were down in Egypt, and God had delivered them by His mighty power, and now God is providing everything for them, and they're complaining again. But the Scripture tells us, do all things without murmuring or complaining, because God is good to us. Let's look on down here again. It says in verse 4 of chapter 11, "And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat?" Now they're complaining because they've got manna, and now they want food. And so it says they fell to lusting. This word fell to lusting means that they craved a craving. They were yearning for something different than what God had provided. They didn't want the manna anymore. They wanted some quail. And it says this rabble rose up and they craved this craving. They began to say, "Oh, did we not eat fresh fish, free fish down in Egypt? And we had cucumbers and leeks and onions. Oh, it was so much better back in the olden days. It was so much better when we were down there in bondage." Look at how our perception can get off when we have a complaining spirit. And this is what Moses was dealing with. And then it bled over into the entire congregation. It says over here later on that they all began to weep and to cry out. So the few complainers and the rabble began to stir up the entire crowd of people. And Moses gets to a point here in verse 10. Listen to what it says. Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. And Moses also was displeased. And Moses said to the Lord, "Wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? Have I conceived all this people? Have I begotten them, that thou shouldest say unto me, Carry them in thy bosom, as a nursing father bears the sucking child, unto the land which thou swearest unto their fathers?" You see, Moses was facing great discouragement. As you begin to lead, as you step into roles of leadership, you too are going to face discouragement. There are going to be people that come against you. They're going to complain. They're going to have strong cravings. They're going to be dissatisfied where they were. They're going to be dissatisfied where they're going, because men and women typically are creatures of comfort. They want to stay in their comfort zones, and they don't want to move to higher ground. And in this case, they said, as we read in chapter 14, they began to decide that we'll choose a leader that will take us backward into Egypt rather than following Moses, the one that God had sent us. And so we're going to follow someone one way or another, but what direction will you go into? And so Moses faces this discouragement. He begins to have a conversation with the Lord here in this lesson. He begins to say something like this: "Lord, why, if you're going to show me favor, then why have you placed this heavy burden on me? Now I want you to know that grace does not lead us to an easier life. And many people think that the grace of God will lead us to an easy life. But I want to remind you that the Lord Jesus Christ was full of grace and truth, and His life was not easy, but we're grateful for the grace of God that was available to Him on a daily basis to be able to move on to God's agenda and to do what God wanted Him to do in this life. The grace of God is the desire and the power to do God's will. It is not going to bring you to a place where it's just a life of ease. If we walk and we enjoy the grace of God, we know the grace of God in the past, we know the present grace of God, and we know the future grace of God is going to be there, but it does not mean that God will lead you into easier and easier places. We see that He was going to call Jesus. He had a lot of difficulty as He began His ministry. The adversary himself came against Him in the wilderness and said, hey, let's stop right here. If you'll bow down to me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. And the Lord said no. He resisted that temptation, but the temptations and the opposition, it grew hotter and hotter the farther that He went into. And the grace of God gave Him the wisdom and the strength to endure the journey, because this is what God had called him to do. The grace of God, I want to remind you, the grace of God is not going to lead you into easier and easier places. The grace of God may lead you into a harder, more difficult place that He might sustain you by His grace, that you might depend upon the Lord. And in depending upon Him, that is the witness that I cannot do this without the help of the Lord. That is the heart of spiritual leadership, is to be led by the grace of Almighty God, to be dependent upon Him, because if we're in it for people, then you're going to get out of it. But if you're in it for the Lord, if you're in your marriage for the Lord, then you're going to submit yourself and say, God, it may get hard, it may get difficult, but God, I trust Your grace will give me the strength to be able to love this spouse until death do us part. God, I believe that if You call me to a certain thing, in ministry in particular, that it's not going to be an easy road, but the grace of God will be there to sustain you and carry you through. But I want you to see what Moses says here, because here's the danger in the life of Moses. The external complaints, the external discouragement began to creep into his soul. It began to creep into his soul, and he began to question the Lord, that God, if Your favor is on me, then why are You giving me such burdens to care for these people? And here's what he says, that hey, I did not give birth. I did not conceive of this nation. I did not give birth to them. Do I have the responsibility to bring them into my bosom and to care for them? And this is another principle of spiritual leadership. It is the ability to be able to lead your own heart well in the will of the Lord, to watch over your own soul, to carry your own life, but to also be willing to take on the burdens of others around you. As we have men in this room that are leading families, and in this case, you have a natural progression that God has blessed you with children. And there is a natural love to be able to lead them well, to lead them not just naturally, but you want to lead them spiritually. That is a principle. But I want you to notice what Moses said. He steps back here and said, hey, I didn't give birth to any of these people. Why are You calling me to come under this heavy burden of leading this great nation? It's because God had appointed him. God had put him in that place that said, Moses, I have displayed My grace. I have revealed My name to you. You know Me, and I have called you. You've given Me your excuses. You said, who am I that I should lead these people? And then he said, what am I? I'm slow of speech. I'm not a good speaker, and I can't do this, and I can't do that. And God said, hey, I'm going to give you the power to do this, and I formed and fashioned your mouth. And if you don't want to speak, I'm going to give Aaron the ability to speak on your behalf. But I've called you out to do this. And you see, God continues to call out men to lead well in the church. And God continues to call out men to lead well in their homes. And it's not something that is something that we look at passively. It's something that we need to lean into. It's something that we need to be assertive and take initiative and realize God has laid on us a burden to carry. We think about the heart of the high priest in the Old Testament and the heart of Jesus in the New Testament. This is a beautiful picture of spiritual leadership. The high priest was to bear this garment that had a breastplate, that had the 12 tribes of Israel engraved on beautiful stones. He carried that on his chest. And on his shoulders there were 6 names on one shoulder and there were 6 names on the other. And that high priest was to go before God on behalf of that nation. That was a picture of spiritual leadership. And oh, how if every man in this room that has a family would carry the names of their wife and their spouses and their children and their grandchildren before the God of heaven on a daily basis, to step into that spiritual leadership, not to be passive, but to say, God, I thank you for the blessing of this burden, because sometimes it can be hard and it can be difficult. But God calls us to step into that and to do it joyfully, because God made us to carry these burdens in this way. One person said that men are like flatbed trucks. They drive straighter with a heavier load. And so God has made us to be willing to carry burdens, not just our own burdens, but to be willing to step in and to lead well those that God has entrusted to our care. One of the responsibilities of an elder of a church, it says, he is called to lead his family well. If he does not lead his family well, if he's not carrying that load well, then it says that he does not need to be willing to care for the souls of the church. And so that's one test, a barometer. But God calls us to be willing to do that. But we see here in the life of Moses that discouragement crept in. It began to creep in. And notice what he says here in verse 13. He says, Whence should I have flesh to give unto all this people? For they weep unto me, saying, Give us flesh that we may eat. I am not able to bear all this people alone, because it is too heavy for me. And if thou deal thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of thy hand. And if I have found favor in thy sight, let me not see my wretchedness. Moses is in a place where this discouragement had come to. He allowed the discouragement from the externals to be something that he began to internalize, that led him to a place of despair. He said, "This is just too heavy." But Moses is not the only one that has been brought to those places. How many men in our culture today, then when marriage gets hard or difficult, this is too heavy to carry. Instead of stepping into those responsibilities, they began, instead of being assertive, and instead of being proactive, instead of taking initiative, they began to step backward, and they step backward, and they step backward. I work among men inside the prison systems that don't even want to handle their own money. They don't want to even take care of their own personal hygiene sometimes. And I heard Bishop Walker down at the church in Nashville say one time, if you've got a man that is unwilling to take care of his own personal hygiene, then that's not someone that you need to be around, because if he can't take care of himself, he's definitely not going to take care of you. And so it's important that as men, that instead of being passive, a real man will reject passivity, accept responsibility, choose to lead courageously. And why do we do it? Because we know that God will bless us as we step into the responsibilities and be obedient to what God has called us to. Do you believe that God will reward faithfulness? Do you believe that God will reward you if this is what He calls you to do, that He will give you the strength and the enabling grace to be able to step into that? And then those moments of difficulty and those moments of despair, that we do like Moses did. He got honest with God, that God, he actually said, this was a hard moment in his life. He said, Lord, if this is the way it's going to be, then just take me out of this world. But that's not the only guy that said that. Elijah said that in 1 Kings chapter 19. He had just seen God God bring down fire from heaven and consume those sacrifices on Mount Carmel. But then Jezebel got a hold of him and said, hey, your life is going to be like the life of those prophets that got slain within 24 hours. And he began to run in fear. He began to abdicate his responsibilities. He found himself under a juniper tree, and God had to send ravens. This is how good God is, that He sent ravens there to be able to feed and care for Elijah there at that water brook. And He said, Elijah, what are you doing here? And he was trying to sleep it off. He was trying to get away from his responsibilities. But brothers, I want to say to you this morning, God has called us to be willing to step up into these places, to be willing vessels, to say, Lord, use me, help me to get my heart in the right place, that I can be used in your service and for your glory. Moses said, this is too heavy for me, Lord. If this is the way it's going to be, I don't want to see my own wretchedness. What Moses said, Lord, if I've got to do this by myself, then it's going to turn into a train wreck. And God said, hey, and He said, hey, where am I going to find the food to feed all these people? This is a place that spiritual leadership brings you to places where you feel inadequate. You feel like you have a lack of sufficiency to be able to do this. And even Paul said, as he was overseeing churches, he said, who is sufficient for these things? You see, in reality, none of us have all the knowledge and all the wisdom and all the resources. But brothers, we've got the resources of God Almighty at our disposal, that as we get to a place that said, hey, Lord, I don't know how we're going to figure this out. I don't know the direction we need to go. I don't know how you're going to provide for these needs. I'm doing all that I know to do to provide for the needs of my family. But God, I don't know how this is going to take its place. That's where we get down on our knees. Spiritual leadership will take you to your knees and lead you to a place of fervency, that you realize that God, if you don't show up and if you don't move in this situation, then Lord, I'm not going to be able to get through it. I'm not going to be able to make it. But how many times when you've got down humble before the Lord, and He says, cast your cares upon Him, for He cares for you. And you realize that His Word says, humble yourself under the mighty hand of the Lord, and He will lift you up at due time. That He just keeps on carrying you, because He desires to see the reflection of Christ in and through your life. And so Moses said, this burden is too heavy for me. It's hard to carry. And God said to Moses that He was going to call out other elders. He actually ordained 70 elders that God said, I will put my Spirit on them, and they will be there to help you lead this company of people, that you won't be in it by yourself. And oh, how God desires to raise up not only spiritual leaders and pastors and elders. We need more. We need more men, young men that are called into the ministry. We need to pray that God would call more out into the ministry, that they might be willing not to say that I'm going to just take care of my own life. And it's good to carry yourself well. And people say that, hey, that you are carrying yourself well in these situations, but we need to pray that God would raise up more, that not only would they carry themselves well, but they would carry their marriage well. And not only would they carry their marriage well, but they would carry their family well, and that God would see that this one is being faithful in these areas, that they can step into more leadership within the church, and they can carry some things well in the church, because you know what? The work of the ministry is a heavy load, and many hands make light work. I want to close here with a few points of application this morning. This is going to be a two-part sermon series, I believe. I thought I might get through it in one, but we're going to have to divide it in two. So we've covered the first point. Spiritual leadership will face discouragement. We should not be shocked when you begin to say, I'm going to speak to the men in particular, if you're out of custom of getting into the Word on a daily basis, if you'll make a commitment and resolve in your heart that I'm going to read 1 chapter of the Bible a day, and I am going to ask the Lord to give me some manna to strengthen my soul, to strengthen my family, to strengthen those that I might come into contact in my workplace or wherever I go today, I can go ahead and tell you, if you'll make that resolve and you will be determined to get up tomorrow morning by the grace of God. This is not legalism. I'm saying the grace of God will lead you to walk in greater godliness. If you will do that, I can go ahead and tell you there are going to be distractions and difficulties and things that will stand in your way that will try to squash that and discourage that. But I'll tell you, if you'll get down and say, Lord, greater is He who is in me than He who is in the world. And I know you want to strengthen me and give me some spiritual food to eat. And you strengthen me and you go throughout that day filled with that Word in your heart and you minister that Word to those around you. I guarantee you, you're going to face some opposition and discouragement. But I'll tell you another thing. You're going to face some blessings too, because God is going to show up and He's going to use you in your life, in your family's life, to be a blessing to those around you. And the adversary doesn't want you to knock the dust off that shine of your witness for the Lord Jesus Christ. He wants you to keep it buried. He wants you to stay in a comfortable place. He wants you to stay in a place where you don't step into more responsibility, but the older you get, you step out of responsibility, that you get to a point, I don't have any responsibility over anybody. But I'll tell you, when you get to that place where I don't have any responsibility, you better be careful. Because an idle mind is a devil's workshop. We're called to be productive. And so, let's look at this just for a moment as I close. Application. God has been so good to us. He has blessed us. What are we going to do with those blessings? Are we going to say, I got saved and I've been saved for 50 years, but I haven't hardly witnessed to one or two or three people? God help us. God has blessed us not to be a bucket, but to be a water hose where the blessings of God can flow in and through our lives and be used to impact others. Application number 2, one or a few complainers can influence a whole congregation of people. Be careful, and God was not pleased with the complaining that He heard. And so God backed him up. Actually says the glory of the Lord appeared among them. And He sent a fire out into the camp among them and began to burn some things up on the outside of that camp to let them know, hey, this complaining spirit is not, you can go before the Lord, but just a complaining spirit, it's contagious and it spreads and it doesn't do good to the whole congregation. Number 3, leaders, parents in particular, will face complaints, cravings, and outcries at times when leading and pursuing God's will. You'll face these things. Moses faced those things. When you begin to go in a particular direction, there will be pushback. We see that in the life of Moses. They were going to the promised land. God said, I'm going to give it to you. But they said, nah. They began to cry out, hey, we'd rather have some food down in Egypt rather than go into the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Number 4, parents are called to lead through these complaints, cravings, or strong passions and cries of the children. The home is one of the avenues that God brings about sanctification in our lives. That will we begin to check out and be passive, or will we step in and lead well? Number 5, external discouragement can become an internal reality in a spiritual leader, which can lead to questioning God and even rebelling against Him. Moses here was tempted to say, Lord, I do not want this responsibility. But God called him to it, and God was going to sustain him and carry him through it. The Lord sends help through other faithful elders who will help carry the load. And I pray that God will raise up more men in this church to be willing to carry the load of leadership in this place. And number 7, the last thing that I want to share. The church needs more men who rely on God for strength to lead their homes well and can take on the added responsibility of caring for the church of the living God. This past week I was going through some things in my office and I found some old notes that I had from some ordinations that I attended of some deacons, and I told them, I sent those notes to those men. I said, thank you for serving in the Lord's church and being willing to take on that added responsibility. And I pray that though there will be many discouragements as you step into spiritual leadership, I pray that you will find encouragement from the Lord and the blessed Holy Spirit, who will lead, guide, and direct us and give us the strength to do everything that He has called us to do. God will be that voice. He will be that one that will encourage you to step in, to rise up, to act like men, as the Bible said, and to be strong and courageous. Because even as in the days of Nehemiah, when they had to build the wall, I think it was in chapter 4, verse 14, it says, "Are not our wives and our children worth it?" And I pray that we'll stand and be accounted before God and step into these roles of spiritual leadership. A real man will reject passivity, accept responsibility, choose to lead courageously, and expect the greater reward. Jesus is our ultimate example. And may we be able to say, "Follow me as I follow Christ." I pray today, if you have not been saved by the grace of God, that you will realize Jesus is leading many sons and daughters to glory. And you need to put your eyes on Him and follow Him all the days of your life, because He's not going to lead us into the bondage of this world. Jesus is leading us to glory. And I pray that our hearts will be set on Him as we get a song and sing this morning.